Afternoon, everybody. I was a little bit more booming than expected. Welcome, and thank you for joining us here today at this panel as we attempt to engage in with one of the more controversial topics, maybe ever, in a thoughtful and academic way. After the Supreme Court ruling on Roe this summer, we decided to jump straight into the fire with this one. So no pressure for anybody here. Before we begin, I'd like to express our gratitude and give thanks to everyone that makes this possible. Thank you to our esteemed and recently retired... Oh, I did it again. I apologize. So I actually have this in my notes to introduce myself, which I never do because I guess I'm not that important, so forgive me. I even have a joke. Normally I forget to introduce myself, and I did it. I'm Derek Ayala. I'm one of the residential faculty members in Philosophy and Religious Studies. I will be your Master of Ceremonies today, and I'm already off to a banging start, so here we go. All right, so again, I would like to express our gratitude to everyone, especially to our recently retired president, Dr. Teresa Leyva Ruiz, as well as our current acting president, Dr. Erne Lara, and thank you to our VPAA, Dr. Scott Schultz. Dr. Ruiz and Dr. Schultz have always encouraged the free expression of ideas and philosophical discourse on our campus, understanding that it's a necessary part of classical liberal education. And when I met with Dr. Lara yesterday for the first time to say hello to him, he assured me that he very much feels the same. So we have a lot of support for events like these on our campus, and we appreciate it immensely. Thank you to Connie Greenwell and Lena Farisi for helping us to organize this panel and to bring in Dr. Knoebel to speak with us. A special thank you to John Heckenleibel and the marketing team, the media department, and facilities. We literally could not do any of this without you, so thank you very much. I'd also like to extend a thank you to the Philosophy and Religious Studies department as well as the Philosophy Club for always putting these things on. Still a selfless self-promotion, shameless self-promotion. Fantastic. To our panelists, it is a great honor to welcome each of you who have been most gracious to join us today, so thank you very much. All of you visiting out from outside the college. If I were to list off every academic thing that our panelists have done, we really wouldn't have time for the discussion itself, so please forgive me as I just kind of run through your highlights. Dr. Angelica Knoebel is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Dallas. She received her PhD in philosophy from the University of I always want to say Notre Dame in reference to France. Notre Dame, I guess, is University of Notre Dame, and specialized primarily in Aquinas' theory of infused virtue, virtue ethics, and applied ethics. She has been a guest on the Thomistic Institute podcast, where she has presented 2 separate talks about abortion, one entitled, Can a Feminist Be Pro-Life? The other entitled, The Philosophy of the Abortion Debate. She has also written a paper entitled Rethinking Unplugging, where she argues for a different pro-life approach to Thompson's famous violinist argument, claiming that those on the pro-life side should bite the bullet and accept it is immoral to unplug yourself from the violinist. Naturally, should be presenting the pro-life philosophical perspective. Dr. Bertha Manninen is a professor of philosophy in the School of Humanities, Arts, and Cultural Studies in ASU's New College of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences. She received her PhD in philosophy from Purdue University and specializes in applied ethics, biomedical ethics, normative, and meta-ethics. You've just got everything. That's awesome. Dr. Manninen has written no fewer than 14 academic articles on the topic of abortion, often presenting a nuanced pro-choice position where she will grant a certain amount of value to a fetus that will sometimes put her at odds with her peers. She has also written a book on the matter entitled Pro-Life, Pro-Choice, Shared Values in the Abortion Debate. This is to say nothing of the numerous times she has presented papers at various philosophy conferences. I think I counted no less than 10 regarding abortion specifically. And finally, Dr. Manninen was kind enough to join the Philosophy Club virtually during the pandemic, where she presented her perspective of the pro-choice position to our club. And thank you again for that. Lastly, but certainly not least, Erica Steinmiller-Perdelmo serves as a legal counsel for the Center for Life at Alliance Defending Freedom. She earned a JD in 2015 from Florida State University College of Law. Before joining the ADF, she clerked for Justice Jorge Labarga on the Florida Supreme Court and for Judge Monica Gordo on Florida's 3rd District Court of Appeal. She also served as a criminal prosecutor in the Miami-Dade County State Attorney's Office, where she tried more than a dozen cases to verdict. She has also written a paper for the Florida State University Law Review entitled "Is Personhood the Answer to Resolve Frozen Pre-Embryo Disputes?" where she argues for granting the legal status of a person to pre-embryos with all the attendant rights. So thank you again for joining us. Excuse me. Now, I imagine you probably noticed that we're a little lopsided in this panel today. Turns out Dr. Manon here is such a force to behold that we needed two to oppose her. When we conceived of this panel, we originally wanted 4 speakers, 2 to present the pro-life and pro-choice side of the philosophy perspective, and 2 present the pro-life, pro-choice of the legal perspective. Thank you all for joining us. It was relatively easy to get this. Unfortunately, when we reached out to the legal organizations to present a pro-choice perspective, we were rebuffed. We reached out to 5 different organizations, 2 of which ignored us, 2 of which said no, and 1 of which emphatically said no. Unfortunately, so they went so far as to say that they would not engage in a both sides style debate because the framing is harmful and women's bodily autonomy is not up for debate. And I'm sure that some of you, if not many of you, agree with that position, and that's fine. However, I will argue that it's not a good strategy for the organization or for the position. Tactically, it is a bad idea that they refuse to engage because they are ceding intellectual ground to their opponents, if for no other thing, tactically. A forum such as this is necessary, or it's a necessary part of a pluralistic society, and it's how we seek to discover truth. That's what we're doing in philosophy, not just muddling the waters. And in a way, I'd argue they've let many of you down because you would have appreciated to see how they would have responded to some of the other panelists. And so that's unfortunate as well. So again, thank you to everyone who did join us today. We're deeply grateful to have you here, challenging us to think in new and interesting ways. We appreciate you taking your time to be with us. I thank you to everyone in the audience who came to see us. You're the reason that we put on these events. We appreciate doing them, we enjoy doing them, and we're glad that you're here. Thank you to any of the professors that offered up extra credit to actually get students to hang out with us. Cool. Now, if you indulge me just a little bit longer, the topic itself. So the question becomes, like, where do you even begin with a topic like abortion? Because it's so enormous, because it's so passionate, because there's so much that goes into it. You know, few topics are so universally contentious and emotionally charged as abortion is. And this is arguably justifiable. I'm absolutely not going to take anything away from that. There is so much at stake for advocates on either side of this conversation. This is precisely why we decided to be bold and maybe even provocative with our title, Beyond the Slogans, Beyond the Rage. At the best of times, slogans are supposed to be placeholders for complex ideas when promoting a particular view on a topic. All too often, however, the slogans end up replacing any meaningful or nuanced conversation, and complicated philosophical ideas and positions get reduced to battle cries, signaling our respectful tribal allegiance. So the importance of today's discussion is to put aside the slogans and strive for a deeper understanding of the topic as a whole. Now, a common occurrence in any discourse, though it seems especially true of abortion, is that we will often talk past each other, not addressing the actual position another person may hold. With any philosophical perspective, a person holds certain premises to be true, and they proceed to build their worldviews based on those premises. With abortion, like many other topics, we either hold very different premises from those on the other side, or we draw very different conclusions from shared premises. Because we think of ourselves as intelligent and reasoning beings, we have derived specific conclusions from said premises. We can sometimes have a difficult time understanding how someone else could arrive at a different conclusion or hold opposing premises from our own worldview. So our hope today is that we will all get to see a broader picture of the abortion debate, including nuanced perspectives we may not have thought about before. Now, with all that being said, the heart of the conversation is the tension between the right to life and the right to bodily autonomy. We hold both of these values, these ideals, to be good things, and ideally we'd say any person is granted a certain set of natural rights simply because they exist. The problem is figuring out exactly how far those rights extend and which right or rights take priority over others. We know that a woman has the right to life and the right to bodily autonomy, even if that's not always exercised in a just way, which we have ample examples of, unfortunately, in society. And we also know that children have a certain degree of rights because they exist. But then the question is, does a new fetal life also have those same rights? If they do, what happens to the rights of the mother? If they don't, when does a fetus become a person? And when are they granted those rights, as well as many others? Thankfully, I'm not the one that has to answer any of those questions today, and I get to pass that off to our panelists. So, just a brief mention of the format. Each of the panelists will have roughly 20 minutes or so to present their position. Afterwards, they will respond to each other if they so desire, and then after that, we will have a Q&A time for the audience, or any of you guys to approach the microphone in the center to ask any of the panelists or all of the panelists a question. So thank you again for being here, and I believe Dr. Manning, you decided to go first? Thank you.
Is this good? Can you hear me? Okay, cool. So thank you all for having me. Every time I talk about this, I always begin with a story of how I got to where I am. So I was raised very conservatively Catholic, and so was pro-life for a good number of years. And then I got to college and was radicalized. No, I'm just kidding. But I was exposed to differing perspectives. And as a result, I decided that I became pro-choice. And then I became pretty radically pro-choice through all my graduate years and wrote my dissertation from a radically pro-choice position. And I was one of those people that said that fetuses are clumps of cells, they're not human, they're not really alive, they're not persons, so on and so forth, which is something that permeates the pro-choice talk a lot. And then, as luck would have it, I got pregnant with my first child, who's now 13. And around 10-ish, 11-ish weeks, we had our first ultrasound. And it was awe-inspiring for me. There was definitely a little baby in there. She had, her arms were moving around, her legs were moving around, she had a head. They would press the wand against my tummy and she would react and she would go and do somersaults and everything. And it was like, wow, this is really more than just a clump of cells. And so I needed to say, how can I now simultaneously be pro-choice with this newfound respect for fetal life that I was experiencing? And I struggled with that for a little while. And then I got pregnant with my second child, who's now 9. And her pregnancy was a little bit more difficult, a little bit more complicated health-wise, and resulted in some permanent health issues that I now have to live with, which is fine because she's totally worth it. But it made me realize how much pregnancy has to be voluntary, right? It's something that it puts an awful lot through a woman's body. There's always medical dangers associated with pregnancy. I have a friend who had an absolute textbook pregnancy. She had no morning sickness. It was beautiful. And then she went to give birth and her pelvis shattered and she had to relearn how to walk, right? And so these are the types of things that make me realize that pregnancy needs to be something voluntarily undertaken by the woman. So those are my two positions. And so I spend the rest of my research days trying to balance those two positions. And so here today, I'm going to talk about that, right? So I'm just going to read if that's okay. I don't have anything prepared, PowerPoints or anything. So in this paper, I will explain 2 reasons why I identify as pro-choice while also explaining why I harbor some pro-life sympathies. I'm pro-choice for 2 reasons. One more utilitarian and one for more Kantian reasons, taking into account considerations from bodily autonomy. All right, the utilitarian one, that's the brief one. I think time and time again we have seen that outlawing abortions does little, if anything, to curtail their occurrence. Studies have shown that the incidence of abortion in countries with restrictive abortion laws are comparable to countries with liberal abortion laws. For example, one study published in the medical journal The Lancet showed that countries where abortion is prohibited altogether or permitted only to save the mother's life has an abortion incidences of approximately 37 per 1,000 women aged 15 to 44. On the other hand, countries where abortion is widely available has an abortion incidence of approximately 34 per 1,000 women aged 15 to 44. Studies also show that, quote, about 70,000 women die each year from the effects of unsafe abortion, end quote. Laws against abortions don't really work. They don't save fetuses, and they put both women and fetuses in danger. The same Lancet study also concluded that, quote, abortion rates have declined significantly since 1990 in the developed world, but not in the developing world. Ensuring access to sexual and reproductive health care could help millions of women avoid unintended pregnancies and ensure access to safe abortion, end quote. There was a recent story that noted that abortion rates in Colorado are declining in tandem with making free IUDs available and easier access to birth control. It is also important to note that countries with low abortion rates, for example, Norway, also have robust social safety net programs, so that the prospect of becoming a parent before you have anticipated it is not as financially detrimental in those countries as it is here. In contrast, single mothers in the United States are statistically one of the most impoverished groups. I will return to this again towards the end of my paper. On June 24, 2022, the Supreme Court of the United States decided the case Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, which called into question Mississippi's Gestational Age Act. This new law outlaws abortion except to save the life of the pregnant woman or in the cases of severe fetal abnormality after 15 weeks gestation. 6 of the 9 justices voted to allow Mississippi's ban to move forward, thereby overturning the 1973 Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade and the 1992 Supreme Court case Planned Parenthood versus Casey. The 6 justices who decided to overturn Roe stated that the United States Constitution does not explicitly mention the right to an abortion. Moreover, they argued that, quote, the right to abortion is not deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition, end quote. Indeed, quote, until the latter part of the 20th century, there was no support in American law for a constitutional right to obtain an abortion. No state constitutional provision has recognized such a right, end quote. They cite several prohibitions against abortion of quickened fetuses in the United States when the woman first feels the fetus move, and also noted that in this country during the 19th century, the vast majority of states enacted statutes criminalizing abortion at all stages of pregnancy. While I'm not sufficiently familiar with abortion laws prior to Roe, I do think that the justices were looking at the wrong place for evidence that abortion laws cannot be found within the history of our nation's laws. If the right to an abortion is considered to be a subset of the broader right to bodily autonomy, we find much more support for such laws in our nation's legal history. For example, there's the 1891 Supreme Court case Union Pacific Railway Company versus Botsford. Clara Botsford sued the Pacific Railway Company for negligence after an upper berth in a sleeping car fell on her head in the railroad car she was riding in, causing damages to the membranes of her brain and spinal cord. The lawyers for Union Pacific Railway argued that they had a right against Botsford's consent to have her submit to an examination by their own lawyers in order to assess the extent of her injuries. The United States Supreme Court disagreed, ruling that, quote, no right is held more sacred or is more carefully guarded by the common law than the right of every individual to the possession and control of his own person, free from restraint or interference by others, unless by clear and unquestionable authority of law. In 1914, the New York Court of Appeals ruled that a physician could not operate on a patient, even if the operation proved to be beneficial for the patient's health without the patient's consent. Judge Benjamin Cardozo, who issued the ruling, wrote that, quote, every human being of adult years and sound mind has a right to determine what shall be done with his own body, end quote. In the 1996 case Stanford Hospital versus Vega, the Supreme Court of Connecticut ruled that a patient, in this case a Jehovah's Witness, has a right to refuse a blood transfusion, even if necessary to save his own life, and that the hospital's interest in preserving the lives of its patients was not sufficient to override the patient's right to bodily integrity. The 6 Supreme Court justices stated that there were not, quote, any scholarly treatises of which we are aware, end quote, that argued in favor of abortion rights prior to Roe. But this is mistaken. In 1971, philosopher Judith Jarvis Thomson put forth a now famous argument that abortions are morally permissible even if the fetus were considered a full person. Thomson asks the reader to imagine that they woke up one day and find themselves plugged into a famous violinist with a kidney ailment. It was discovered that you and you alone has the right blood type to save him, and so the Society of Music Lovers kidnapped you and hooked you up to him. But it's only for 9 months. Are you morally required to stay plugged into the violinist? And can you be forced to stay hooked up to the violinist? Thompson argues in the negative. No one's right to life entails that someone else can be forced to use their body to sustain that life. Now, this may seem like a fantastical thought experiment, but consider the following case. In 1978, the Common Court of Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, decided the case McFall v. Shimp. Robert McFall was suffering from aplastic anemia and needed a bone marrow transplant to survive. His cousin, David Shimp, was a genetic match, but refused to undergo the extraction procedure. McFall took Shimp to court with the hopes that the judge could force Shimp to donate. Although the judges had sympathy for McFall's position, they ruled that they could not force Shimp to donate, even if this meant McFall's certain death. Quote from the courts. The common law has consistently held to a rule which provides that one human being is under no legal compulsion to give aid or take action to save another human being or to rescue. A great deal has been written regarding this rule, which on the surface appears to be revolting in a moral sense. Introspection, however, will determine that the rule is founded upon the very essence of our free society. For our law to compel a defendant to submit to an intrusion of his body would change the very concept and principle upon which our society is founded. To do so would defeat the sanctity of the individual and would impose a rule which would know no limits, and one cannot imagine where the line would be drawn, end quote. It is deeply entrenched in our social practices that we do not put the right to life of one person over the right to bodily autonomy of another. Blood or bone marrow cannot be forcibly extracted, even to save lives. Organs cannot be harvested from a corpse without express permission from either the person while she was alive or the next of kin, even though approximately 17 people die per day awaiting an organ transplant. Our country does not require people to save the lives of other people. We are not required to be what constitutional scholar Donald Reagan calls good Samaritans, even in cases where life can be saved. To force a woman to gestate is to force her to be a good Samaritan. As Reagan writes, quote, "It is a deeply rooted principle of American law that an individual is ordinarily not required to volunteer aid or another individual who is in danger or in need of assistance. In brief, our law does not require people to be good Samaritans. If we require a pregnant woman to carry the fetus to term and deliver it, if we forbid abortion, in other words, we are compelling her to be a good Samaritan. The Equal Protection Clause forbids imposition of these burdens on pregnant women," end quote. The concurring justices of Supreme Court may be right that the explicit right to an abortion is not found in the Constitution, nor explicitly found in laws pre-Roe, but we can derive the right to an abortion via the clearly uncontested laws and practices that the individual has a right to security of her person, which includes the right to control her body. If we view pregnancies as Thompson and Reagan view them, to force a woman to gestate forces her into a state of bodily intrusion that we have never required of any non-pregnant person. Pro-life supporters aren't arguing that fetuses have the same rights as you and me. They're arguing that fetuses should have more rights than you and me, since none of us have a right against anyone else's body. Immanuel Kant's second categorical imperative provides an ethical underpinning to this issue. Kant argued that all rational beings have intrinsic value, and one way to respect that value is by treating persons as ends in themselves rather than as a mere means to an end. Forcing people to give their bodies over to sustain the life of another treats them as a mere means to an end. While the end may be a noble one, according to Kant, the consequences of such an action do not render it permissible. To use a woman's body as a means to gestate the fetus against her will treats her, in essence, like a broodmare, and is a grave violation of Kant's imperative. Now, one thing I get asked a lot about my pro-choice stance is where I stand on the reference to later term abortions. Do I think abortion should be accessible throughout the whole of pregnancy, including later term pregnancies? Now, am I in favor of a woman being pregnant for 8 months and then just wantonly decided they want an abortion and just walking into a clinic to abort a healthy fetus? No, of course I'm not in favor of that. But you'd be surprised how many people believe that this routinely happens. But that's not what typically happens in cases of later abortions. According to the Center for Disease Control, over 80% of abortions take place in the first trimester, and 98.3% of abortions take place before the third trimester. This means that what we're talking about here are 1.7% of abortions. This is hardly an epidemic. And in those cases, the vast majority are women who have discovered that their fetus had an affliction that is incompatible with life or that will render its life one fraught with pain and suffering. Take, for example, the words of Emily Rapp, who admits that had she known while pregnant with her son that he would suffer from Tay-Sachs disease, she would have opted for an abortion. Here's her words, quote, "If I had known Roden had Tay-Sachs, I would have found out what the disease meant for my then unborn child. I would have talked to parents who are raising and burying children with a disease, and then I would have had an abortion. Without question and without regret, although this would have been a different kind of loss to mourn, and would by no means have been a cavalier or uncomplicated, heartless decision. I'm so grateful that Ronan is my child. I also wish he'd never been born. No person should suffer in this way: daily seizures, blindness, lack of movement, inability to swallow, a devastated brain with no hope from a cure. Both of these statements are categorically true. Neither one is mutually exclusive." End quote. Here's another example of a man cradling his dying child who suffocated to death after he was born with an inability to regulate his breathing. The family opted against abortion, but held the baby as he died. Quote, 30 minutes, there's no visible signs of life. You rock his limp body as tears fall onto the blue blanket. You wonder what sort of animal you are. 45 minutes, grandma looks in, ashen face, seeing in a glance that it's over. Shortly, your wife appears. She immediately takes your son's body and his arm and cuddles him. She sits there with him for 3 hours. You should not have let your baby die, you think to yourself. You should have killed him, end quote. Here's one more example. In 2016, Erica Christensen obtained an abortion at 32 weeks gestation after it was discovered that her fetus was suffering from an affliction that resulted in an inability to swallow in the womb and consequently an inability to breathe once born. The condition was deemed incompatible with life. The baby would either die during birth or would live only a short time before choking to death. Christensen and her husband opted for termination, knowing immediately that it was the most humane possible conclusion to this pregnancy, end quote. These are the kinds of cases that make up most cases of later abortions, which again are only 1.7% of all abortions. So do I approve of the wanton destruction of a latent healthy fetus? No, but I also think that anyone who thinks that this is what typically happens in later abortions have a poor understanding of what women who opt for these abortions are going through. No woman gestates a fetus, feels it move and grow inside her, that at the last minute wantonly and willy-nilly decides that parenthood isn't for her and demands the abortion of a healthy child. Going back to Thompson and the violinist example, its main purpose is to circumvent the pro-life claim that fetuses have a right to life by showing that even if they do, this doesn't entail that abortions are impermissible. But it also does something else. It allows me to acknowledge fetal personhood and not compromise abortion rights. I can feel bad about the life that is lost in an abortion while still maintaining that women have a right to decide for themselves whether they want to continue gestating. By analogy, I feel bad that McFall died without also saying that Shipp should have been forced to give his bone marrow. McFall's life had value, even if I can't force Shrimp to give up his body to save McFall's life. Similarly, I do believe fetal life has value, even though I don't think women can be forced to gestate. 5 years ago, I confided in a few friends that I had miscarried what would have been my third child. A few weeks later, I attended the birthday party for a friend's child and was pulled aside by my friend's father, a vocal conservative Christian. He told me he was sorry for my loss, but that I should be able to get over it soon. This is because he knew that I'm vocally pro-choice and that I have been defending women's reproductive rights in my academic work for years. I didn't regard the pregnancy as a lost baby, he said, so the aftermath of my miscarriage should not be so bad. I excused myself from the conversation, went outside, and cried. 5 years later, I remember that conversation with sadness and anger. Why did he assume that losing that pregnancy would mean nothing to me? Why did he think that being pro-choice meant that I didn't value the embryo I lost? While some of these can be attributed to insensitivity and ignorance on his part, I have to admit to myself that some of that fault lies in the lap of the pro-choice community. Oftentimes, the pro-choice community is reticent when it comes to expressing respect for embryonic and fetal life. And consequently, we have been largely silent on the issue of pregnancy loss. Like it or not, the view that pro-choice advocates are indifferent to fetal life is a pervasive one, and it is one that our community has not done much to contradict. Consider the words of Francis Kissling, the leading Catholic pro-choice advocate and former president of Catholics for a Free Choice. Quote, "The precise moment when the fetus becomes a person is less important than a simple acknowledgement that whatever category of human life the fetus is, it is not nothing. It nonetheless has value. I am deeply struck by the number of thoughtful, progressive people who have been turned off to the pro-choice movement by the lack of adequate and clear expression of respect for fetal life," end quote. Kissing implores the pro-choice community to articulate, quote, respect for life, including fetal life, end quote, and chastises them for ceding the moral high ground to anti-choice advocates. Quote, should we allow this value to be owned by those opposed to abortion? Are we not capable of walking and chewing gum at the same time, of valuing life and respecting women's rights? Have we not ceded too much territory to anti-abortionists already by not articulating the value of fetal life, end quote. Consider the words of some women who are hesitant to align themselves with the pro-choice community, even though they believe in reproductive rights. For example, there's Heidi, a woman who not only has procured an abortion, but also steadfastly believes that all women should have the same choice. Yet she is reluctant to self-identify as pro-choice because, in her view, the pro-choice community has largely neglected to take seriously the value of fetal life. Quote, I find myself not being a great supporter of the pro-choice movement. When I ask myself why that is, since I believe in the right to choose, what comes back as my answer is that it is something that you are killing. You are killing a child. So many pro-choice advocates treat it as just a medical operation rather than the taking of at least a potential life, end quote. Feminist Lindsay Van Gelder tells the story of her abortion and how she sought comfort in the pro-choice community only to have her feelings dismissed. Quote, I desperately wanted a feminist article, a pamphlet, or speech, anything that would have let me have both my abortion and my own ambivalence. I wanted to deal with the moral balance sheet of abortion, not to have to deny that one existed for me. Instead, people kept telling me I was misguided, brainwashed by the patriarchy. They patiently explained to me that the fetus was just a bunch of cells, end quote. Another girl states, quote, I only get mad when a friend tries to tell me it's nothing, oh well, it's just an abortion. It wasn't the abortion itself that troubles the woman, rather it's her friend's nonchalance. Quote, even if it was nothing, it was still something, end quote. There are many women who do experience grief after abortions, though this is not indicative of a mental disorder, as people who believe in post-abortion syndrome believe. The grief does not equal regret. Emily Rapp felt grief when her son died, but would have chosen to abort him had she known his condition. But it does come from a place of acknowledgement that the death of the fetus is a morally significant death, and that referring to the fetus as merely a clump of cells does not capture the reality of abortion for many women. Here are some examples. There's Bobby Jeanne Kennedy, an abortion nurse, who writes about dealing with the emotional reactions of women post-abortion. She tells the story of a woman who, quote, reached out her beautifully delicate young hand, gently touched the cheek of her newly aborted tiny fetus, and said to it, I'm sorry, baby, end quote. Another woman obtained an abortion after her fetus was diagnosed with a deformity. Quote, the woman said, I don't want to deny this baby existed. She gave it a name, had a funeral for it, and buried it in a plot alongside her grandmother, end quote. Another woman, Heather, procured an abortion and described how difficult the whole experience was. She also says she felt, quote, angry at the feminist movement, which I am wholeheartedly a part of. I didn't expect such an emotional experience. I felt betrayed that abortion was made to look like an easy decision, and it wasn't for me. I had to carefully weigh it all out. It was still the right choice at the time, but I still had to cry, to grieve the loss of this potential child and the loss of my pregnant state, end quote. So, how can we simultaneously be pro-choice while acknowledging that fetal life has value? We can start by working to create a society where abortions are less common. And we don't do this by prohibiting abortions. The criminalization of abortion in some states means that women with monetary means will travel to other states to procure an abortion. This means that these prohibitions will disproportionately affect poorer women, and we may see an increase in self-induced abortions, as was the case in pre-Roe days. The World Health Organization estimates that, quote, 45% of all induced abortions are unsafe. Developing countries with strict anti-abortion laws bear the burden of 97% of all unsafe abortions. Each year, around 13% of maternal deaths can be attributed to unsafe abortions. Evidence shows that restricting access to abortion does not reduce the number of abortions, end quote. One way to make reducing abortions rates a key aspect of the abortion rights movement, and one way that we do that is by fighting for social causes that are regarded as stereotypically liberal. Wide access to free and effective contraception, medically accurate sex education, and social welfare programs designed to meet the needs of women and children who face financial insecurity. A 2008 study from the University of Washington found that teenagers who received medically accurate sex education were approximately 60% less likely to get pregnant compared to abstinence-only education. According to the Colorado Department of Health and Public Services, between 2009 and 2013, the birth rate amongst teenagers fell by 40%, while abortion rates fell by 42%, after the state started providing teenagers and poor women free intrauterine devices. Repeated studies on these issues illustrate similar conclusions. Quote, "The most direct way to reduce abortion rates is to prevent unintended pregnancies by increasing the practice of effective contraception," end quote. It is clear that socioeconomic reasons play a prominent role in a woman's decision to abort, and alleviating those obstacles can go a long way towards reducing abortion rates. 42% of women who procure abortions earn an income 100% below the federal poverty level. 75% of women cite responsibility for others as a reason for aborting, and the same number of women cite financial restrictions or fear of having to compromise work or education as reasons for aborting. Single-parent households headed by women often face crippling poverty. A 2015 study illustrated that single mothers were at far greater risk of living in poverty than single fathers, and that this was worsened with each additional child. A 2012 study noted that among affluent democracies, the United States, quote, "has the highest rate of poverty among single mothers," end quote. European countries with low abortion rates share some consistent commonalities. Not only do they have liberal abortion laws and wide access to contraception and sex education, they also have robust social welfare programs that make the prospect of an unplanned pregnancy, especially amongst young individuals, less daunting. Consider, for example, the Netherlands, which legalized abortion in 1984 but has one of the lowest abortion rates in the world. Contraception is widely available free of charge, but in addition, quote, the Dutch government provides a range of what sociologists call social and what reproductive health advocates call human rights, the right to housing, health care, and a minimum income. This might make the prospect of sex derailing a child's life less haunting, end quote. A vital factor in alleviating poverty for single mothers is adopting robust social welfare programs. One study showed that, quote, "generous, comprehensive, and universal welfare states substantially reduce the poverty of single mothers," end quote. In other words, when a country guarantees the basic sustenance of its members, the rates of poverty decrease substantially. Alleviating the financial strain on women who are facing the prospect of an unplanned parenthood will simultaneously mitigate one of the leading reasons women choose abortions. I will end by noting that many individuals in politics who claim to be pro-life simultaneously consistently vote against the very social programs that can help curb the incidence of abortion. In 2021, the Children's Defense Fund Action Council introduced a nonpartisan report card to highlight how congresspersons voted on legislation aimed at improving the welfare of children. Many of the lowest scores were attributed to Republicans who self-identify as pro-life. Within the past few years, Republican politicians have proposed completely defunding Planned Parenthood, despite the fact that one of its primary functions is to provide reproductive health care and education and access to contraception for millions of disadvantaged women. Moreover, they have also advocated withholding all federal funds from the Title X Family Funding Program, whose main role is to provide contraception and reproductive care services to poor women. I do believe that pro-choice advocates should take seriously pro-life concerns about respecting fetal life. But conservative pro-life advocates need to listen to some pro-choice concerns as well. The societal practices that have been shown to actively reduce abortion rates are those which feminists and liberals actively champion. Thank you.
Thank you, Bertha. That was, there's so much to think about there, and I look forward to our conversation. And I want to thank Glendale Community College for having this event and for inviting me to be a part of it. I can't say enough how important I think it is to have conversations like these, particularly when people disagree and when people disagree vehemently. We have to have these conversations. We have to keep having them, and we have to try and be understanding and respectful of each other in those conversations. So I'm just really grateful that you guys do these types of events. I come at this from a different angle. As mentioned in the introduction, my specialty is an old dead guy who lived in the 1200s. But, you know, when you get hired as a philosophy professor and they're like, oh, okay, virtue, all right, you can teach applied ethics. And so my first job out of grad school, I had 2 sections of applied ethics, you know, teaching all this stuff that, you know, I probably had opinions on, but I wasn't an expert in. And I in order to look myself in the mirror in the morning, I had to figure out what I thought about this stuff, and I had to read. And so my interest I kind of came at this sideways, so to speak. And so I'm just going to kind of share my thoughts about this debate and the angle and kind of what I think are the key issues at stake here. So 41 years ago, at the beginning of his famous book, After Virtue, Alistair MacIntyre pointed to debates about abortion as an example of the incoherence of contemporary ethical discourse. In MacIntyre's view, common ground on abortion is rendered impossible by what he calls the incommensurable premises of either side. Since each side asserts as fundamental a premise that the other side denies, civil discussion, let alone agreement, becomes impossible, and public conversation about abortion inevitably devolves into shrillness. MacIntyre is certainly right about this much. Even 41 years ago, when he said that, discussions of abortion seemed to have arrived at an impasse. And if impasse was the right way to describe discussions of abortion then, one can only wonder how one ought to describe them now. But I would characterize the source of the problem a bit differently. I think the problem is not the supposed incommensurability of first principles, but rather that each side has shown itself unable or unwilling to acknowledge and wrestle with the very real and important concerns raised by the other. That inability gives rise to a mutual perception of dishonesty and bad faith. And I think it is the perception of dishonesty and bad faith, more than anything else, that is the true source of the ill will that each side feels for the other. So in what follows, I'm first going to elaborate on my claim, namely that popular discourse on each side of the abortion debate tends to ignore and obscure a central concern of the other side. Having done so, I'm then going to turn to philosophical treatments of the same in an attempt to get at the real source of disagreement. I'm going to argue that the real question comes down to this: can we be obliged to make significant sacrifices for others simply because we happen to be the only ones in a position to help? And I want to argue that we can be and are so obliged. So a few weeks ago, some of you might remember this, a portion of a comedy routine by Bill Burr went viral on social media. After explaining that he believes and has always believed in a woman's right to obtain an abortion, Burr continued, eliciting laughter from the audience, "However, I still think you're killing a baby. See, that's where it gets weird." To continued laughter, Burr pointed out that the baby's death is in fact the entire purpose of the abortion. She's not going in there for an earache, and compared the claim that the fetus isn't a baby to the claim that a cake still in the oven isn't a cake. The mere mention of abortion, even in a comedy show, is often enough to suck the air out of a room. But Burr not only elicited laughter, but went viral on social media. And I think it's interesting to ask why. I think the humor stems from the fact that Burr, having voiced his support for abortion, then acknowledged something that the average popular supporter of abortion typically does not acknowledge. He acknowledged that abortion, regardless of why it is chosen, involves the deliberate ending of a human life. It is so rare for somebody who supports abortion to openly acknowledge this uncomfortable truth that it is sometimes funny when they do. And it is this that is the greatest source of frustration for many opponents of abortion. Because for them, the fact that gets downplayed and ignored and swept under the rug is the fact that matters. It is the fact that keeps abortion from being merely health care or merely a matter of bodily autonomy. The opponent of abortion can certainly sympathize with the difficulties an unplanned pregnancy creates, and certainly abhors the vicious acts that cause some pregnancies as much as anyone else. She just can't get past the fact that abortion resolves the situation by killing a child. And when supporters of abortion refuse to acknowledge this, when they will not even so much as discuss any sort of limit at any stage, when they refuse to call a heartbeat, well, then she begins to believe they are arguing in bad faith. But the difficulties are not all on one side. Popular pro-abortion rhetoric obscures the uncomfortable fact that abortion involves the killing of a child. But popular pro-life rhetoric downplays and obscures its own uncomfortable truth as well. Feminism holds out the promise of freedom. It insists that women ought to be able to be anything they want to be and do anything they want to do. And women of my generation learned at a very early age to not just embrace that freedom, but to demand it as our birthright. But to what extent is that freedom, freedom of opportunity, of education, of lifestyle, compatible with serious and sustained opposition to abortion? Popular pro-life rhetoric insists there is no real problem here. No problem, at least, that sufficient social engineering cannot fix. Opposition to abortion is compatible with feminism, they argue, because women don't actually want to have abortions. Women have abortions because they are forced into difficult situations beyond their control, situations from which abortion seems to be the only escape. And they argue that with the right social structures, women can still have it all without recourse to abortion. No woman, a pro-life advocate recently claimed, should have to choose between her child and herself. And it sounds nice, but it's also not true. Fleetwood Mac lead singer Stevie Nicks obtained her first abortion in 1979 when her band was just beginning to take off. A child, says Nicks, would have meant the end of everything. There's just no way I could have had a child then, said Nicks, working as hard as we worked constantly. And there were a lot of drugs. I was doing a lot of drugs. I would have had to walk away. Olympian Sanya Richards-Ross, similarly, says that when she found out she was pregnant with her fiancé's child shortly before the 2008 Olympic Games, an abortion seemed like the obvious choice, even like no choice at all. Richards-Ross is less enthusiastic about her abortion than Nicks is about hers, saying that it broke her. But abortions, Richards-Ross told Sports Illustrated, are prevalent among track athletes. Richards-Ross and Nicks, to be sure, chose between motherhood and superstardom. But countless other women have offered similar, albeit more mundane, stories. Stories of being too young or too old, of wanting to finish school, of a career that was just beginning to blossom, or even of just not wanting a child at that particular point in their lives. And at the end of story after story, very many women simply say, I chose myself. The uncomfortable truth that opponents of abortion won't or can't or at least haven't grappled with then is this. One cannot ensure access to everything feminism has taught women to demand by providing diapers and healthcare and housing. Stevie Nicks didn't want healthcare, she wanted a platinum album. Sonia Richards-Ross didn't want diapers, she wanted an Olympic medal. No amount of social engineering could have made their pregnancies compatible with those goals. And the fathers of their children, each of whom were superstars in their own right, never had to make that choice. Women do. When we tell women they cannot have an abortion, we just are limiting their options, just are limiting the extent to which they are free to pursue everything men pursue, and just are giving the lie to the claim that a woman of today can be anything she wants to be. Opposition to abortion is not altogether incompatible with feminism, but it does constrain the kind of feminist one can be. Supporters of abortion ought to be honest about the fact that abortion involves the killing of a child, and opponents of abortion ought to be honest about the fact that prohibitions on abortion limit and curtail the feminist dream. Popular discourse about abortion has not done a good job of acknowledging either point. Turning to the philosophical questions that underpin either side can help us see what is really at stake. At least some philosophers who support abortion have tried to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that popular rhetoric tries to ignore, namely the fact that abortion involves the ending of a human life. One strategy is to insist that the fetus, while human, does not have moral value, that it is not a person and thus can be killed with impunity at any stage. To make such an argument, though, one must explain why the developing fetus does not have moral value. Since things like size and appearance are clearly problematic indicators of value, most philosophers who wish to defend such a claim do so by focusing on the fetus's inability to do the things characteristic of mature human beings, its inability to think, desire, etc. If one makes presently possessed rational ability the criteria of moral value, then the fetus is excluded. But so are many of the elderly, many of the mentally disabled, young children up to a year or later, and so on. And few are ready to go so far or to sign on to such an ableist account of value. A different strategy, though, is simply to concede, at least for the sake of argument, that the fetus possesses the same moral value as the rest of us, and argue that even if this point is conceded, abortion is still permissible in most or even all cases. The best example of such an argument was put forward a long time ago by Judith Jarvis Thomson. Thomson argued that merely having a right to life does not entitle one to everything necessary to life, especially if the things one needs impinge on the freedoms and desires of others. The child, she argued, has a right to life, but unless its mother freely offers it the use of her womb, it has no right to take up residence there. She argued that should it turn out to be the case that the child is residing uninvited in the mother's body, the mother has every right to forcibly evict it, even if she cannot do so without killing it. Thomson has, I think, articulated the real philosophical question at the heart of the abortion debate. Am I obligated to make significant sacrifices on behalf of another simply because it is in need of life-sustaining support that I am ideally situated to provide? A great many have found Thomson's emphatic no intuitively appealing. The appeal of that no, I think, comes down to this. Many of us believe that we should be free to be the architects of our own destiny, and we believe that we should be free to reject whatever gets in the way of the path we have charted for ourselves. This belief has such deep roots, particularly in American culture, that even those who oppose abortion have hesitated to question it. In fact, I think it is that hesitancy that leads opponents of abortion to insist that prohibitions on abortion are completely compatible with all the aims of feminism, and to downplay and deny the idea that motherhood might limit one's life choices. Freedom and autonomy are supposed to be sacred. But deep-rooted or no, I think the perception is a false one. In the rest of my remarks, I'm going to offer some reasons to think that, especially when another person's life is on the line, we can and do have unasked for obligations to others. Thomson's model of moral obligation is what some philosophers call voluntaristic. Because we are fundamentally autonomous, we are bound only by the obligations we freely and voluntarily adopt. But however attractive this view might seem in the abstract, it is by no means clear that it is correct. Are we really fundamentally autonomous? Do we really find meaning and fulfillment in charting our own course and ordering our lives as we see fit? Or aren't our lives fundamentally intertwined with those of everyone else in such a way that the flourishing of one is tied up with the flourishing of all? We depend on others not only before birth, but for a great many years afterward. Most of us are again dependent on others as we near the end of life. Even in between, when we are more or less capable of seeing to our own needs, we still need other people and define ourselves in and through our relationships with them. Who, at the end of the day, is really autonomous? Who even wants to be? But if our lives and our well-being are fundamentally intertwined with the lives and well-being of others, what choice is only mine? What decision really affects only me? Feminist philosopher Eva Kittay, drawing on the work of Robert Gooden, contrasts Thomson's voluntaristic model of obligation with what she calls the vulnerability model. On Thomson's voluntaristic model, my obligations to others originate in my own voluntary agreement. I am obligated to do only what I have promised to do. But on the vulnerability model defended by Kittay and Gooden, we are fundamentally dependent, and exist most fundamentally in our relationships with others. On this model, it is not our voluntary agreement, but our relationships that generate our obligations. Merely being the person best situated to meet the needs of another, on this view, can generate an obligation. Now, Kate does not and does not want to push her view this far, but the implication is obvious. It seems like on the vulnerability model, the fetus's mere dependency on its mother can generate an obligation. Why opt for one view over the other? Well, in the first place, despite the initial appeal of the voluntaristic model, I think the vulnerability model proves on inspection to do a better job of capturing our moral intuitions. By way of making her case, Thompson points to the example of Kitty Genovese, who was supposedly murdered while her neighbors watched. If we do not think bystanders are required to so much as intervene, she argues, then we should not think that women are required not to abort their children. But her example actually illustrates the opposite. Why did the story of Kitty Genovese, as told by the New York Times, sell papers? It sold papers because it horrified its readers. Why did it horrify its readers? Surely because they recognized something had gone wrong, that merely being in a position to meet a need did generate an obligation. And in fact, we now know, thanks to Netflix and their documentaries, in fact, we now know that the original newspaper story deliberately misrepresented events. There were not 38 eyewitnesses to the murder, and the very few who saw something did try to help. I think it is only natural that one might seek a way out of the obligations the vulnerability model imposes on us. But at the same time, I think we intuitively do think the vulnerability model of obligation makes sense. We just went through a global pandemic. We asked those best situated, the medical profession, to make huge sacrifices and to risk infection themselves in order to help those who are ill. We asked the healthy to make huge sacrifices in order to help those most likely to become infected. Did any of us, even the doctors and nurses, volunteer to be so obliged? If so, when? In what way? It seems more reasonable to merely say that there were people in need, that others were in a position to meet that need, and we asked it of them. It is easy to see how the vulnerability model helps the vulnerable. But Kate makes a rather different observation about the vulnerability model. Kate argues that only the vulnerability model can make sense of our having obligations to the caregivers. A friend of mine tells the story of asking her department chair for time off from teaching after the birth of her child. "I don't ask you to cover my courses while I go skiing," he replied. "So why should I cover yours just because you decided to have a child?" The example helps to make Kate's point. If my obligations arise only from my choices, then providing care for an infant or a disabled child or an ailing parent is no different than a choice to go skiing. But if I am obligated to take on the former and not the latter, then others who are in a unique situation with respect to me will also be obligated by my needs. The vulnerability model goes all the way up and all the way down. If I am obligated to provide care, then my employers and others who are in turn uniquely situated to meet my needs will also have an obligation to make space for my caregiving. I think the vulnerability model is accurate. I think our obligations, even, perhaps especially even the most arduous of them, arise simply in the course of living. Our obligations to others, even those that require us to radically reorder the course of our lives, even the ones that interfere with our hopes and dreams, very often arise as accidents of time and place. They are unfair in the sense that they are unevenly distributed, but they also make life valuable and meaningful. A life without obligation would be a life without others, and who would really choose that? The obligations that arise from pregnancy and motherhood are not evenly distributed. On the vulnerability model of obligation, of course, the burdens of pregnancy will not fall only on the mother, because others in a position to help her with her burdens will be obligated too. Nonetheless, we should admit the truth. Biology dictates that pregnancy burdens some of us in ways it does not burden others. Embracing the vulnerability model seems to embrace that unfairness. And that is true. But I am not at all convinced that the inevitable inequity of obligation is a reason to reject the model. If obligations arise from relationships, then innate differences in relationships will always result in innate differences in obligations. The mother's relationship to her child is of necessity different than anyone else's, and so it will, of course, generate different kinds of obligations. But unless we are prepared to reject the value of the relationship itself, we cannot reject the obligations it generates. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much again for being here. My name is Erica Steinmiller-Perdomo, and I serve as legal counsel on the Center for Life at Alliance Defending Freedom. And so we've heard now from philosophical perspectives on both sides of the aisle, and I'm here to bring in the legal perspective, to talk about what are our laws for, what should our laws do, what rights should our laws protect, and the historic moment that we are in following the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health that is allowing us to be here together to have this discourse. Because for the first time in 50 years, we can actually think about implementing laws that are reflective of the will of the people. So I want to start from the beginning in terms of the legal landscape of abortion rights. For the first 185 years after the adoption of the Constitution, each state was permitted to address this issue in accordance with the views of its citizens. States enacted their own laws on the issue, and there was no federal prohibition that applied to all the states. At the time that the 14th Amendment was adopted in 1868, three-quarters of the states outlawed abortion at any stage of pregnancy. And the trend for the first almost 200 years of this country was to outlaw abortion. Even up until the 1970s, in 1973, the year that Roe was decided, 46 states outlawed abortion, either entirely or they had some restrictions. Specifically, there was 30 of those states that prohibited abortions at all stages, except to save the life of the mother, and others still regulated them more strictly than Roe would allow. In the 1970s, just up until 2 years before the Supreme Court issued its decision in Roe v. Wade, no one imagined that there was a right to abortion enshrined in the Constitution. Nobody even argued it. And then again, the laws of almost all of our states were reflective of that. But when Roe was decided, the Supreme Court created a new right to abortion. The Supreme Court in Roe v. Wade acknowledged that there's no textual right to privacy in our United States Constitution, but that this right emanates from the First, the Fourth, the Fifth, the Ninth, and the 14th Amendments. And then gleaned from this right to privacy that must be somewhere in the Constitution, that there was a right to abortion. What the act of the Supreme Court deciding this did was it stripped the people of their right to be heard on this serious moral question, and it imposed an extreme view of abortion that actually put the United States in a league with very few countries, including China and North Korea, on the expansive view of how much we were going to permit abortion. And again, this was opposite of what most of the states that the United States wanted at the time that the Roe v. Wade decision was released. So Roe prohibited states from then on from passing laws that protected the unborn or mothers and stole from the American people this right to preserve the dignity of women and the dignity of all human life, causing the loss of over 60 million American babies in the United States since 1973. To justify this new right that it created, the Supreme Court then had to make up a test. It's called the trimester test, which basically said that a woman's rights were different at each stage of her pregnancy. So depending on the trimester of your pregnancy, your attendant rights are different. This proved to be an unworkable framework. First, it said that in the first trimester, the abortion decision was left to the woman's medical physician. It didn't say it was left to the woman. It said the woman's doctor can decide about abortion. In the second trimester, the court recognized that the state, in promoting its interest in the health of the mother, may regulate abortion procedures in a way reasonably related to maternal health. But then after viability, and this seems to be the key line that is later endorsed in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, after viability, the state, in promoting its interest in the potentiality of human life, may, if it chooses, regulate and even prescribe abortion, except for the preservation of the life or the health of the mother. One important thing to note is that Roe recognized at that time the state's important and legitimate interest in potential life. But this framework that it created, it essentially pulled it out of thin air. And even abortion advocates have criticized the Roe decision as a poorly reasoned decision. Even the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg realized that this was heavy-handed judicial intervention, that it was difficult to justify. Legal scholars, even pro-choice legal scholars, have recognized that this decision looked a lot more like legislation and have acknowledged, oh, well, I would vote for a law much like the one that the Supreme Court put forth in Roe, but recognized that Roe was not constitutional law. And so I want to pause here one moment and just talk about the role of the court versus the role of the legislature, because that's something that our dialogue can focus on right now. So what Roe did was, it's called judicial activism, and it has the effect of creating law that is not the role of the courts. So we have our elected lawmakers in Congress and in each of our states that they're the ones who are responsible for passing legislation. And they are voted into those positions by the people that they represent. But the court, especially the Supreme Court, nobody is electing those judges. Nobody is putting them in those seats except for the president who appoints them. And so their role is to interpret the Constitution and to interpret the laws that are on the books, not to create new laws. So Roe, it was a violation of this separation of powers we saw the judiciary encroaching into this more what looked like a lawmaking function that was not appropriate. And then we have the court revisiting this issue of abortion in Casey in 1992. At that time, the court in Casey, it did not endorse the reasoning in Roe and actually realized that there was some flaws in Roe's reasoning, but they still reaffirmed the central holding that, oh, well, you can, starting from this viability line, the state can have a compelling interest in regulating abortion, but before that, it should not. And then it actually threw out Roe's trimester test that was made up and then gave people a new test. Well, now we're going to have this undue burden standard, and states cannot impose any restrictions on abortion if they would cause an undue burden on a woman's right to an abortion. And this undue burden standard, again, it was difficult for courts to implement, and it was confusing, and it was a standard that it was a concept unheard of in law. So, and it applied for things, even any kinds of regulations, like states passing laws that certain doctors need admitting privileges in a nearby hospital, or that the size of the hallway in a facility where they're performing abortions has to be wide enough for one of those hospital beds to roll through. So common sense regulations like that, if a court determined it inflicted an undue burden, they were not allowed to stand under the Casey framework. And so it really just didn't even allow for states to implement reasonable common sense restrictions. Then fast forward now to 2022 in the Dobbs decision, Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health. I want to note that 26 states asked the Supreme Court to overturn Roe and Casey when they were considering the Dobbs decision. That's more than half of the states in this country. And Dobbs correctly held that the Constitution does not confer a right to abortion, and that abortion is not deeply rooted in our nation's history and tradition. What the Dobbs decision actually did was return to the people through their elected officials the right to affirm the dignity of women and to protect unborn babies for the first time in 50 years. The states and communities could now have the opportunities to affirm human rights. But what the Dobbs decision did not do is outlaw abortion. And if you looked at the news following the Dobbs decision, or when there was this leak at the Supreme Court, you'd think that that's what the court did because of this extreme reactions to what the court actually did. And so that's part of what I want to do today is just clarify and explain, like, one, the role of the court, and two, why the Supreme Court, in issuing this opinion in Dobbs, actually returned the integrity to its judicial function in interpreting the Constitution and in interpreting federal law, and then freed the rest of us, you and me, gave us the opportunity to be heard on our positions on this important moral question. And you've just heard from both of our panelists who have highlighted the nuance of the positions on both sides of the aisle. And both of them have come up here and explained how, there's pro-choice advocates who they won't concede any essential point to the pro-life argument, and so there's no room for dialogue if we're not able to even have discussions. But now, for the first time in 50 years, we're able to have these discussions. And so, yeah, I just wanted to clarify. The Dobbs decision did not outlaw abortion, and it did not attempt to even answer this question about whether abortion is right or wrong. It just allowed freedom now for the democratic process, for people to have discussions, for people to elect representatives who will vote consistently with their beliefs, and for states now to enact laws that reflect the will of their people. So again, the Dobbs decision, it overruled Roe and Casey as egregiously wrong and unworkable. The Supreme Court has a process for evaluating whether laws that are not specifically mentioned in the text of the Constitution are still guaranteed, but those rights need to be something that's deeply rooted in our nation's history and tradition and implicit in the concept of ordered liberty. And so the court realized that abortion had no place in the nation's history and tradition. The Dobbs court went to great lengths to go back into our country's history to set the record straight on a lot of the false premises that the Roe v. Wade decision was based on. It discussed the certain common law criminalization of abortions, and highlighted, again, that at the time that the Roe decision came out, most states had prohibitions on abortion. And Dobbs held that abortion laws are subject to the same constitutional scrutiny as other laws regulating health and welfare, and that's the rational basis review. So then the court now reimposed a test that this rational basis test that is used to evaluate laws that judges know how to apply, and is a well-rooted test, so that is applied to certain rights. And laws must be upheld if there's basically this test is that laws will be upheld if there's a rational basis on which the legislature could have thought that it would serve legitimate interests. And these state interests, they can range, they can be any number of things. To highlight a few that are prevalent on the pro-life side is, one, respect for and preservation of prenatal life at all stages of development, protection for maternal health and safety, elimination of gruesome medical practices, preservation of the integrity of the medical profession, mitigation of fetal pain, and prevention of discrimination on the basis of race, sex, or disability. I want to talk a little bit about specifically what Mississippi's law did. That was the law that the court considered in Dobbs. Mississippi had enacted this 15-week ban. So after 15 weeks, the state had a compelling interest in regulating abortion. Prior to that, based on the Roe and Casey framework, under the viability line, it was somewhere around Roe, it was somewhere around 24 weeks. Then at the time of Casey, it was earlier than that, maybe 22 weeks. But the problem with the viability line is that viability is different from person to person and even from pregnancy to pregnancy in the same woman. The question of viability is, can the fetus exist outside of the womb of the mother? And we've seen with medical advances that yes, as we continue to advance medically, the fetus can exist outside the womb of the mother earlier and earlier and still survive and still, become a perfectly healthy baby. So that viability test is not really workable. And so Mississippi enacted this 15-week ban, recognizing that even pre-viability, we should have an interest in regulating this life, because at 8 weeks, at 6 weeks, the baby's heart begins to beat. At 8 weeks, an unborn baby begins to move about in the womb. By 9 weeks, all physiological functions are present. The baby has teeth and eyes. By 10 weeks, the baby's vital organs begin to function. The baby has hair and fingernails and toenails. And by 12 weeks, the baby is taken on the complete human form. They can open and close their fingers, they can make sucking noises, and sense stimulation from the outside world. Dr. Maninin spoke about seeing the ultrasound of her 11 or 12-week-old baby and seeing her moving about freely in the womb. So Mississippi, in enacting this act, realizes the humanity of the baby as early as 12 weeks, and then pointed out that after 15 weeks, the baby can feel pain, and the abortion procedures performed after 15 weeks are particularly gruesome. Most of the time, what's used after 15 weeks is called a dilation and evacuation procedure, and that involves tearing the baby limb from limb out of the mother's womb. And the legislature of Mississippi found that this medical practice was particularly gruesome, and to protect the integrity of the medical profession, we want to be able to have reasonable restrictions on this. And also, Mississippi realized that abortion carries significant physical and physiological risks to a maternal patient. And these physical and physiological risks increase with gestational age, meaning later on in your pregnancy, the risk to the mother increase. Importantly, as the second trimester progresses, in the vast majority of uncomplicated pregnancies, the maternal health risks of undergoing an abortion are greater than the risks of carrying the pregnancy to term. So that's why they enacted this 15-week ban. And then the court, considering this and interpreting federal law, looking again at the Constitution, they did what the court is supposed to do and realized and held that there was no constitutional right to an abortion, and that it's the legislature's job to make policy, not the courts. So now we're in this landscape of post-Dobbs where states are empowered to enact pro-life laws to support women and protect their unborn children. After 50 years of scientific developments, I think there's no doubt that we are dealing with a human baby here. It's scientifically indisputable that human life, a human being, is formed as of the moment of conception. And so now we have this conversation about, okay, well, then when does the state have an interest in protecting life. If we can say that, and even as some of my panelists have recognized, if there is value in fetal life, well, then at one point can the states get involved to protect their citizens, to protect fetal life. So pro-life laws affirming, so what the pro-life movement would like to see, what we would like to see is states restricting abortion, but then enacting laws that provide protections for women, provide support for women who are facing unplanned pregnancies, and take funds out of funding of abortion and provide those funds to actually provide support systems for women to cover costs associated with pregnancy and to support maternal health for instances where there are certain risks for women who are in certain pregnancies. But I think it's demeaning to say that women are not capable of being moms and living happy, successful lives. And I think that that's, if you see the dissenting court in the Dobbs decision tried to make that argument that losing a right to kill an innocent life in the womb means that women cannot participate equally in society, means that women can't have the same opportunities for work or for school. I think that premise is not true, and I think that it's demeaning to women. And I think that part of our conversation now post-Dobbs is, well, how can we actually protect women and protect fetal life? But surveys show that most women who have abortions say that they would choose life if they had support. And that's why we want to focus on this, because most women do not want to have an abortion. And has been acknowledged earlier on this panel, most people know that it's wrong. Most people know that what you're doing is ending a human life. That's what an abortion is. It's intentionally ending a human life. There are thousands of pregnancy centers around the nation that are ready to support women, to provide free material resources like diapers, food, cribs, car seats, as well as parenting classes or education to help people become parents, to prepare people to become parents. But if turning back to what Roe did was, again, it made the United States an extreme outlier in abortion law and policy. But 75% of nations, aside from the United States, they don't permit abortions at all, and most of them limit them at 12 weeks, which, again, is the point where this is a fully formed human being, and it just needs time to grow and develop in the womb, just like we all continue to grow and develop even outside of the womb. If you poll most Americans, they don't agree with abortion on demand until birth, and only 13% of Americans favor allowing abortion in the last 3 months of pregnancy, and the majority of Americans oppose abortion even in the second trimester. So that's really the pulse of the people. That's really where the attitudes of the people are. And our state laws that are governing abortion, they're going to vary depending on the people in those states that are voting. But some of what we've seen are states that are enacting laws to protect unborn life and mothers in a variety of ways. There's some states that have created gestational age limits, outlawing abortion after 6 weeks when the heart begins to beat, after 15 weeks when the baby begins to feel pain, or after 20 weeks, which is pretty much that point of viability. And these were not allowed under the Roe regime. I want to note that all of these laws, all the laws that we see being enacted around the states, they include exceptions to protect the life and health of the mother, and they don't prohibit treatments for miscarriages or ectopic pregnancies. I feel like this has been a huge talking point post-Dobbs. There's been a lot of, I'm going to say, misinformation and fear-mongering about what Dobbs did, and now women can't get treatment for ectopic pregnancies or can't get miscarriage treatment. Those are not the same thing. And up until July of this year, if you even went on Planned Parenthood's website, they said a treatment for ectopic pregnancy is not an abortion. Now, all of a sudden, post-Dobbs, they've scrubbed their website and changed their position and said, well, some treatments for ectopic pregnancy could look the same as some abortions. That's not true. Doctors know that that's not true. And so to create this stir of fear in emergency rooms following Dobbs was really disingenuous, because this messaging was promoted that, oh, doctors, you can't exercise your reasonable medical judgment and help a woman who's in a life-threatening condition of an ectopic pregnancy because that might look like an abortion and you're going to get prosecuted. Well, no, that's not what the state's laws are trying to do. Nobody's trying to criminalize a doctor for treatment for an ectopic pregnancy, because what an ectopic pregnancy is the fertilized egg, it does not implant in the mother's womb, and it tries to implant in a fallopian tube or somewhere else where it is incapable of growing, and where it will cause severe risk to the mother's life and possible death if it bursts. So, this is a sensitive medical issue, but the doctors know that treatment for that condition, which happens in about 1 of 50 women, is not the same thing as an abortion, because an abortion is the intentional killing of an unborn life in the mother's womb. And the same for miscarriage. And you can ask any woman who's suffered a miscarriage. They know it's not the same thing. Suffering a miscarriage is a tragic loss of your baby versus, again, going out and intentionally seeking abortion for other reasons. And again, the pro-life laws that are being enacted in states right now, they include exceptions for these kinds of conditions. Another interesting set of pro-life laws that we're seeing and advocating for are to prevent discrimination against babies in the womb based on their race, sex, or disability, because every human being has equal dignity, value, and worth, and we should not say that a baby can be aborted because of their race, sex, or disability. And I would argue even a severe fetal abnormality. But we do have states that are making exceptions for certain situations like that, where the baby does suffer a severe fetal abnormality. Another thing we're seeing in pro-life states is funding for pro-life pregnancy centers to help mothers facing unexpected pregnancies. So Mississippi just passed a $3.5 million tax credit for donations to pregnancy centers to help women in crisis pregnancies. The Texas legislature approved $100 million to go towards pregnancy centers, maternity homes, and related programs over 2 years. And so these laws are trying to ensure support for women and their families in crisis pregnancy situations. But then we have, on the other hand, states that are trying to expand access to abortion. We have several states that will be considering proposed ballot initiatives in the upcoming election in November to add fundamental rights to abortion in their state constitutions. One, I think, particularly concerning type of law that we're seeing is laws that allow elective abortion on demand up to the point of birth, and even what's termed perinatal deaths, which would not criminalize a born alive fetus dying on a medical table due to the neglect of the doctor or the mother. So I think that the conversation around the abortion rights, because there's been all of this fear-mongering messaging that's put out there saying women are losing all of their rights, and now they're trying to overcorrect and say, well, women have the right up until birth of their child, or even up until after the birth of their child if they decide not to care for the child and the child dies within several days after being born. So I think that it's important to have a discourse to talk about what are the laws that are trying to be passed in your states, and think about what interests you want your laws to protect. One other issue I wanted to talk about was the attempted expansion of accessibility to chemical abortions, because chemical abortions are particularly dangerous for women. After the COVID-19 pandemic, the federal government rolled back protections for the distribution of chemical abortion that makes them available now through telehealth, and you can get them mailed to your door and take abortion pills and have an abortion in your home. But these pills are being prescribed to women without any in-person test with the doctor, without any confirmation of the gestational age. And a lot of women, they don't know how far along they are when they get pregnant. They don't know how far along they are until a doctor tells them, oh, you're 4 weeks, oh, you're 6 weeks. A lot of time, women are guessing early on. And so if you have a woman in a telehealth appointment with a doctor who's not getting an ultrasound and saying, oh, I think I'm 8 weeks pregnant, but the woman is 10 or 11 weeks pregnant, and then getting these pills through the mail, they don't have informed consent about the risks that are being posed to them through that process. And chemical abortions can be particularly gruesome and are increasingly having more and more complications that are sending women to emergency rooms because they're bleeding out, because they were not prepared or were not told about the severity of the pain that they would be experiencing when they have these contractions to expel a dead baby. And it's particularly harmful for women. And the increasing accessibility of it while saying, oh, well, you don't need to come into a doctor's office, you don't need a test, you don't need any follow-up, just go home and take care of this by yourself. It's leaving women in a position where they are experiencing this traumatic event by themselves in their home with no medical advice or care or attention. And so I think that we need to be mindful of how just this push for wide availability of abortion access to women, how that can also serve to harm women in many situations. And we have to be able to have honest and factual discussions about this in order so that we can protect women and protect babies in our laws post-ops. Thank you.
I now ask for 15 minutes of silence for our missing panelist. Now I open up to each of you if you have any responses you'd like to present to each other. I'm a little bit informal about that, so as you just want to have a casual conversation.
Do you have an order you want to go in?
I do not. So if any of you have any pressing points you'd like to address first, feel free.
Well, Dr. Manin, I'm going to mispronounce your last name. Maninen?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So I really appreciated your remarks, and I actually think we agree on a lot of things. I wanted to raise just a couple points. First off, I think you were absolutely right when you pointed out that getting pregnant changes your perspective. Because for me, I was 41 and I'd sort of, been pro-life my whole life and had an incredibly difficult pregnancy just throughout the whole 9 months. And I can remember like driving on the Washington Beltway, puking into a Ziploc bag, trying not to have a wreck. And I had this thought, it's like, I get it. Not like, oh, I'm suddenly like pro-choice, but just like, I get it, right? Just I had never empathized with what women go through until you go through it. It's different. So I appreciated your comments about that. I wanted to press you on one example, and then I wanted to kind of throw out an idea where we might differ. So I guess the examples, I see what you're saying when you were talking about the example of the guy who wanted his cousin's bone marrow, right? And you used a phrase, we can't force women to gestate, or we can't force people to volunteer aid. And I guess for me, I want to push back on that a little bit, because to me, I guess the difference there is it's less like someone's drowning and I have a boat than it is like they were drowning, they're now clinging to my boat, and I'm like beating their hands with the oar, right? I mean, the reason I'm kind of using that dramatic imagery is, right, because in the case of abortion, you're already gestating, the baby is already growing, and the question is, and I can't get out of the situation except by killing it. And so to me, that's a little bit different than volunteering, being asked to volunteer aid. This is a situation in which I am willy-nilly in this situation. The child is growing, and I have to kill the child to remove myself from the situation. And to me, so I wanted to kind of press you on that. Then I guess the other thing, and this is actually kind of related, it has to do with your final remarks about late-term pregnancies or late-term abortions. And I mean, I'm more skeptical perhaps than you are that they're all usually, almost invariably these kind of tragic cases. But I guess for me, I see the unborn child as a person, and I don't think I also don't believe in euthanasia. I mean, maybe, I wonder if that's where we differ, because I don't think it's right to even kill a disabled person. And I see late-term abortion as the killing of somebody because they're disabled. And, I mean, I have many friends who have had children who died shortly after birth, and they welcomed the child and tried to make it comfortable and grieved its passing. And to me, there's something very beautiful there when you say, I only have this child for a little bit of time, but I'm not. I mean, so I guess to me, I wonder if the difference comes down to, I just don't think it's okay to kill an innocent person. I'm fully aware that might be an unfair way of characterizing the difference. I don't know. But I just wanted to throw those thoughts out there.
Is this okay? All right, cool. I think my first response is I don't see pregnancy as equivalent to the boat example. I think that being pregnant is very unique. It's hard to make an analogy. I mean, even the Thompson one has problems with the analogy because it's such a rare, a unique thing. But a violation of someone's body is a violation of the self, right? It's not like a boat or you're renting out a room for 9 months. It's a violation of a self. So when you violate someone's body, think about why rape is such a horrible thing, because it's a violation of the body and it's a violation of the self. So when we prohibit abortions, we're violating a woman's sense of self, not just her property, right? It's deeper than that. At least I think it's deeper than that. In terms of the euthanasia of a late-term fetus, I guess I see it less as a disability issue. Like I don't want to raise a Down syndrome child. I'm thinking more of situations like Tay-Sachs, where there's an immense amount of suffering going on. So that the idea is to curtail suffering, not reject a baby because it's disabled. But it is a euthanasia issue. And I've said that before often, that late-term abortions are morally more equivalent to euthanasia than to early-term abortions. But see, I guess when it comes down to the suffering of the patient, I don't have a problem with euthanasia. I do have a problem with euthanasia when it's just like, I just want to get rid of someone because they're disabled, versus I want to get rid of someone because they're in pain, right? And I think that late-term abortions can be more of the latter than the former. Did I get everything?
Can I just respond real
Yeah,
real
of course,
quickly?
of course.
So, I mean, with the bodily integrity and the violation thing, though, I guess this is what inarticulately, I guess this is what I struggle with, right? Because I don't see the child as violating assaulting my autonomy. I mean, the baby is exactly where it's supposed to be. I had a student once who said, and we were reading Thompson, and this kind of, did you issue an invitation and things like that, and then she uses this example of the burglar, or like the burglar, and the student goes, well, it's not like a burglar got into your house. It's like you mailed out invitations to a party, and now you're running and trying to get them back, right? I mean, but to me, I don't see the child as an intruder or an invader. I mean, the child hasn't done anything wrong. Very often, the person who created the child has done all kinds of things wrong. I'm more than willing to accept that, but I don't see the child as the child's where it's supposed to be. I mean, so I struggle to see that as an assault on bodily autonomy, that the child is there doing what growing children do and have done since the beginning of the world. I guess I do struggle with that aspect.
Well, when you invite people to parties, you still have a right to end the party and throw people out, right? I mean, so even
But
when,
you don't have a right to kill them to get them out.
well,
That's the difference.
if they were violating your health in a way that's deeply intrusive, and the only way to get out of that intrusion is through self-defense, then you do.
Okay, but that would, just to be clear, that would significantly limit your support of abortion, right? If you're only going to accept it in the cases where someone was going to die regardless, right?
Well, it's not just death, though. It's physical health. I mean, any pregnancy always carries with it a danger of severe physical health. Every single one of them: preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, deep vein thrombosis, a birth where your pelvis is shattering, you have to learn to walk again, right? So pregnancy always, even a healthy pregnancy, carries with it severe dangers to a woman's health.
Sure,
Right?
it does. But, I mean, I guess I took you to be arguing that if I just don't want to be pregnant anymore, that's okay. So, and to me, I mean, this is a life that we're taking. So I guess that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't mean to not.
No, that's fine. No. Do you have anything else, or? Do you have questions? I don't know who goes next.
Yeah, if you have anything you want to add.
I have a question for you, if that's okay.
Yeah.
One thing that you brought up a lot is that the Dobbs decision pushes back the decision to the states and to the will of the people. But there have been politicians, Mike Pence, one of them, and Blake Masters, who's running for Senate, who want a federal abortion ban. And particularly Blake Masters it's not there anymore. He's cleaned it out of his website, but it was there because I saw it. I should have taken a picture of it. But he said that he wanted a constitutional change, an amendment to grant fetuses personhood that'll make abortion federally bad, federally illegal. So I was wondering what you thought of making abortion federally a crime, so that it's not a state decision anymore. It's the opposite of Roe. It's prohibited in every state.
I think that's one of the questions that Dobbs left open. Dobbs didn't touch that question. It didn't attempt to answer the question about fetal personhood. In fact, I think it specifically, stated that it was not doing so. Our Congress has certain enumerated powers. It has enumerated powers over regulating interstate commerce, over spending powers, and so I think that it remains to be seen how Congress thinks that they can use those powers. We have seen Congress use those powers in certain ways to protect life. For example, partial birth abortion bans that restrict instruments that are instrumentalities of interstate commerce from being used to accomplish a late-term abortion. And those kinds of laws that protect life have been upheld. But what we know Congress cannot do is force states to participate in interstate commerce and force abortion to be legal at the state level, levels. But I think that there's questions that remain to be answered that the Supreme Court has not touched on yet.
But would you support a federal abortion ban?
I think I answered your question. The law on that area is not settled.
Okay. Can I have a question for you? This is really quick. Have you read, it's one of my favorite articles of all time. Have you read Hearst House on abortion?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I absolutely love that article. It has a profound effect of the way I view it as well. And I was just, I don't know, we should talk about that maybe during dinner because everybody's not familiar with it.
So
But it's such a great article.
It's a wonderful article. It's very vivid. I'll just put, because it's relevant actually to, I mean, 'cause so Hearst House begins that article. So Hearst House, for those, can you guys hear me? Do you need this? Oh, I don't have it on. I was just projecting. So Hearst House begins that, so she argues that the fetus is not a person.
Right.
And she has this kind of list of things that we expect people to be able to do, and we base our assessments of moral value on that. But it's interesting, right? Because, and this is, I would love your thoughts on, because she begins that article by saying that if you convince her that the fetus was a person, then she would be against it.
Yeah.
And because she says you don't get to kill trespassers on your property. And so I was just like,
Yeah, no. I'm again, really, I like when she talks about that abortions could be either virtuous or vicious, and that the motivation for getting the abortion is important. But yeah, sorry, it's.
Yeah, no, and Thompson talks about that too.
Yeah, the
right?
indecent versus decent
Right,
abortions.
that you can be
yeah.
cold, callous, and cruel, but
Yeah.
not unjust.
Right.
Which
right.
is something that I've always struggled with.
Yeah.
Because I guess I think it comes down to a different, what's your view of justice? Because I'm not sure that you can be callous. And I mean, so there are interesting
Yeah.
differences there, I think.
Yeah.
Any other points? All right. Well, we now open up the floor to all of you. If you have any questions for one or all three, feel free to line up at the mic and ask your questions.
Yeah. Is this thing on? Oh, hey. Okay. What's your name in the middle?
Erica.
Erica? Okay, so you talked about the judicial branch's role with laws. Why are you against judicial activism? Because you talked about how Roe v. Wade was judicial activism, and that's like a form of making laws, and that's not the role of the court. Why are you against that?
Because I think that our system of government in the United States has a system of separation of powers. That is how we have checks and balances against the different branches of government. And so when the legislature encroaches on that lawmaking function, and it's an unelected body who's not beholden to the people, and they don't have any kind of check, I think that violates the will of the people to be heard.
Yes.
No, not the legislature, in the judicial.
So would you say you were against the ruling in Brown v. Board of Education?
No, I would not say that.
So would you say you were against the ruling of, let's say, Obergefell v. Hodges?
Why don't you ask me what your real question is?
The judicial system has such a deep history with judicial activism, both on conservative and liberal sides, that I believe that it is a fundamental part of what the court's job is. When the legislature fails, the judicial system steps up. Loving v. Virginia, interracial marriage, obviously Brown v. Board of Education, all examples of judicial activism. Why do you think that judicial activism is not its role?
Well, I don't think that those are all examples of judicial activism, and I think we're talking about a lot of different types of laws here. One subset of laws that you're talking about are those laws that protect a right to bodily autonomy that's enshrined in privacy. And what the Dobbs decision did, it didn't undercut this right to bodily autonomy. It didn't say there is no privacy protections in the Constitution. It just said that the right to take the life of an innocent human being is not one of them. And so the Dobbs court went to painstaking lengths to try to clarify its position that it was not setting any kind of broad brush test that's trying to eviscerate other rights.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Hello. So I have a question. You guys bring up discrimination against disability a lot, which has happened in the past and is still happening in some countries. Like Iceland was called out by the UN for aborting 100% of its Down syndrome babies. So with that in mind, like the whole discriminating against disabled people or discriminating against people based off of sex or race, do you think that abortion is a right to a dead baby or a baby being outside of the womb? And if it is a right to a baby outside of the womb, would you guys be okay with abortion or would you still be against it?
I think that abortion is the right of a baby outside the womb. I don't think that if it's possible, and Thompson says this too, right? That if it's possible for the fetus to survive, you don't have a right to slit its throat. That's the way she responds to it. So if the baby survives an abortion in whatever way, I think it absolutely needs to be cared for like any other patient.
If I supported abortion, I would share her view.
So, you as well, would you accept abortion if it was the right to have a baby outside the womb and not a right to kill the baby?
I'm not really exactly sure what your question is asking, but I think that human life has dignity and worth from the moment of conception, and that we should enact laws that protect the human beings from that point.
So if a baby can survive the abortion, would that be fine with you? Like if we took care of the baby outside of the mother?
I think that has to do with this question of viability, and I've made this argument, for example, in a paper talking about in vitro fertilization, where the life is created outside of the womb of the mother, and I would say that that is a viable life that is capable of growing and completely developing outside of the mother's womb, maybe if it's implanted in another woman, for example. So I think that we should protect life at every stage.
Thank you.
I guess I had a similar about the protecting the life of the baby. Rather than abortion being killing it, why don't we talk more about how to protect the life of the baby while if a mother isn't able to take care of it, you can allow the woman to take the baby out and give it to someone that can be able to sustain the life. That didn't make much sense.
Are you talking about like situations of adoption or like surrogacy?
I'm not exactly sure. Maybe.
I think I get what you're going at.
Okay.
So she's asking about like why can't we be talking about how to save the baby outside of the womb? Because if abortion is the right to have a baby outside of you, not to kill a baby, then maybe we should also be talking about trying to figure out ways to help save the baby. So instead of just killing the baby outright, we can try and find out a way to have both sides where the baby doesn't die and the baby is not in the womb. Yeah, so for an artificial womb.
I think I've heard something about those, but I don't know if any of you would like to answer that question.
I mean, I'm wondering if I can just try and kind of clarify the point that you're making, because I think you're pointing to an important facet of the discussion. I don't know if you're going to get any of us to defend what you're thinking of,
Okay.
but I think it goes back to your question. Do you think abortion is a right to a dead baby or a right to not have the baby inside of you? Mm-hmm. I worked for a while in a pregnancy center. My job was to enter data into the computer because the computer had crashed. It was super fascinating for me.
Happens a lot
Because
places.
No, but it was super fascinating to me for this reason. I entered lots and lots of case histories of women who had had 12, sometimes 12 abortions, tons of abortions. And eventually they stopped having abortions and they started having children because they couldn't take it anymore. I never, in all of the case, and there was a question on the intake form, would you consider adoption? and I never saw, and now, this is not an empirical study, right? I'm not claiming to be a scientist here, right? But no form that I entered, and I entered hundreds, had that checked yes, right? And I think that being a mother, I think that there is I have trouble being away from home because I'm worried about how, like, my daughter being able to go to sleep without me, right? She's fine, but I worry about this, right? I think when you're a mother and you have a child, you don't want anybody else taking care of that child. And so I wonder if, you're kind of posing up a hypothetical. Wouldn't people be fine if we could just take that baby and, like, grow it in a machine and, like, give it to all these people who are willing to adopt or whatever? And I'm just going to go out on a limb and say, no, women wouldn't be fine with that. And I say that, right? Now, I'm opposed to abortion, so, like, I clearly am not fine with that. But I don't think any woman is fine knowing that there is her child out there somewhere, wondering if it got put to bed, wondering if it's loved, wondering if anybody cares about it. It's gonna kill you. And so I think that's kind of what you're pointing to, and I'm just kind of pointing to the problem, right? I think that's gonna be a big problem.
I do agree that there's, like, a big problem with, like, the foster care system, and we need to take care of that, like, especially if we're going to be banning abortions at, like, a certain time or something like that. We should be taking in mind, like, are these babies that are going to be, like, thrown to the wind, are they actually being taken care of and that sort of stuff? But also, I am women, and I've never been pregnant, but I've never had a want for a child, and I don't think I would ever want a child, even if I was pregnant. But also, I've never been pregnant, so I don't know. But I'd personally be fine with a baby being, if I accidentally got pregnant and a baby was out there, as long as I know they're maybe taken care of, I'd be fine with it. But that includes taking care of the foster care system and figuring that out. Because right now it's a wreck.
And I just want to say that I think that, it's like Solomon, right, and the story in the Bible, right? I think that were you to become pregnant, you would suddenly have more problems with it than you think you might. Right?
I have not read the Bible, so obviously, but
no, sorry.
So if you want to clarify that story for me, that would be helpful.
So there's a story in the Bible where two women King Solomon is reputed for wisdom, right, in the Old Testament. He's supposed to, have asked for wisdom and been given it, and two women are fighting over a child. They both say it's theirs. And they come to King Solomon, and he says, fine, easy. We'll just cut the child in half. You get the head, you get the legs, we're good. And one woman says, okay. And the other woman says, no, give it to her, right? And Solomon says, see, that's her kid, right? Because he knows that the woman, now this kind of is a story even in favor of adoption, right? I would rather let somebody else raise it than have it die. But I think what you see in the case of adoption is that very often women would rather have their child die than not be able to raise it. I'm just throwing that out there.
Wild, because I would not want a baby to die, but I guess people are like that. But
no, I agree with you, and I think adoption is a wonderful thing. I just think we have to be honest, and I don't think it's as easy a fix as it's sometimes made out to be, just because I don't see a lot of women being willing to lay awake every night wondering if that child has been loved.
Also part of that might be because the foster care system tends to be pretty bad. I've met many people who were adopted or are still in the foster care system who have been abused. And I think it's been literally all of them that I've met. So I think maybe one was just very depressed because they didn't know where they were from. But and that's unavoidable when it comes to adoption. But the other ones, like rape, child molestation, that sort of stuff, I think those can be fixed, especially if we figure out the foster care system, figure out child protective services, and try and fix those. And I think those should be more of a priority than the debate over whether abortion is correct or not. Because if you're going to ban abortion, even if you're not going to ban abortion, can we please take care of the foster care system? Because if there are going to be extra babies now, I think we really should take care of that.
No, of course. And also, I think open adoptions are something that I didn't know about, right? But if more people would just opt for open adoptions, which lets the birth mother be involved and see the child, I think we could solve some of these issues too. So I appreciate the point that you're making.
I would love to talk to you after, but like there are many other people who have questions. It was a great conversation. Thank you.
Hello. So I had a question more regarding the legal aspect of things. So there was a lot of emphasis put on sort of decentralizing the issue and leaving it up to states and communities to solve these types of things. And as I think you said, the majority opinion is being taken into consideration. But I didn't really hear a very solid argument against it necessarily being contained within bodily autonomy. And so that has a pretty slippery implication of majority opinion outweighing what could potentially be considered a human right. So I was wondering how you would respond to that potential criticism.
Let me clarify your question about,
Okay.
can you explain a little bit more about what you mean about it not being in the bodily autonomy?
So if specifically speaking to your presentation, I didn't necessarily see adequate justification for it to not be a right. It's not enumerated directly within the Constitution. Mm-hmm. But if we are to even consider that it potentially could fall under the purview of bodily autonomy, then that could lead to potentially dangerous implications as far as how rights are perceived in the country.
Well, what the Dobbs Court said squarely is that there is no right to abortion that can be gleaned from the right to privacy or the broad right to bodily autonomy, because we're dealing with something categorically different in the question of abortion, because it's terminating an innocent human life. So it's different than the other privacy interests that are protected by the Constitution. But at the state level, for example, we do have, for example, ballot initiatives for constitutional amendments to state constitutions. There are some that are trying to enshrine a right to abortion, and then there may be states that decide to enshrine a human right that begins from the moment of conception, the right to, either defining the status of the person from that moment, and to assign rights as early as conception.
Okay, thank you very much.
I want to thank all the panelists for showing up today and providing their view and presentation. My question is for all panelists, because we have a lot of discussion about fetus, baby, life, clump of cells. A lot of different terms are thrown around for a discussion like this. So to your understanding or in your opinion, what constitutes a human life? Additionally, what conditions of personhood need to be met for life to be granted constitutional rights, natural rights, if you believe in either of those? For example, factors such as consciousness, bodily autonomy, some degree of what definition might be of sanity, anything like that. I just wanted to kind of lay that out there because that really guides the conversation with where everyone's coming from, what their definitions are, and there seems to not be a lot of definition in that aspect of the conversation while we're going through the conversation.
I think in terms of your first question, there are what constitutes a human life and what constitutes a person are two separate questions,
Correct.
right? Yeah. So what constitutes a human life is, it's true that at conception you have a entity that is separate from the woman, that has its own genetic structure, that is growing, that is taking in nutrients. So, and it's human, right? When my students say to me, well, fetuses aren't human, I'm like, I don't, what other species are they, right? I had a human baby, I didn't have a dog, right? So it's clearly a biological human at conception, and I agree with that. But that's different from what does it mean to be a person, right? But that's a moral question. To me, a personhood should be tied in with consciousness. That's my personal, and that's what I argue for in my dissertation, that consciousness is important because at the time that someone is conscious is when they have the birth of the mind. And the mind is what makes you a person. And the continuation of that mind is what continues your personhood. So me personally, I think once we have evidence that a fetus is conscious, it becomes a being with whom I would be okay ascribing some rights to.
Thank you.
I would disagree with that line. From the moment of conception, a unique life comes into being, and life is a human right. So I think back to Martin Luther King Jr., I have a dream that all men and women are created equal. Where are we created? We are created in our mother's wombs at the moment of conception. That is when that life comes into being. And from that moment, I think we have an inalienable right to life, to live. And it's so problematic to me to define life by consciousness or being a sentient being when even a newborn baby, a born baby, still is completely dependent on the mother for all things. Last year, my 96-year-old grandmother passed away in October. A couple of weeks before she passed away, my sister was in the hospital. They went in the hospital on the same day. My sister gave birth to a little girl. My grandmother went into the hospital. And in the following weeks, I saw this striking parallel between my sister's newborn baby and my grandmother, who were essentially in the same state of life. My grandmother could not articulate any words anymore. She couldn't remember at times who she was talking to. She could not eat on her own. She could not move from her bed. Like, she looked in all respects just like this newborn baby. And there might have been moments there where she completely lost consciousness, where she's just, gaping mouth looking into space. But there's no doubt in my mind that my grandmother was still a person. And so defining personhood by any kind of those characteristics of being is unworkable to me, and it leaves so many vulnerable people in our population unprotected by law. And I think that we should have protections for people at all stages of life, no matter what their dependence on other human beings is.
Thank you.
So, I think your question is a great one. I think it gets down to the heart of the matter. If you look at the history of philosophy, the value of a person, rationality has always come into the definition, right? All the way back in the Middle Ages, a human being is a person of a rational nature, right? Where the difference comes in, right, is what do we mean by that, right? What do we mean by putting rationality into the definition of a person? Do we mean that it's normative, meaning that rationality goes into the definition? What's that? Oh, okay, sorry. Do we mean that you're a person if you're the kind of thing that ought, under appropriate circumstances, to be able to exhibit rationality? Well, okay, that sounds great to me. If that's our definition, infants are in, the elderly are in, the mentally disabled are in, because they ought, under appropriate circumstances, to be able to express rationality, and so they have value. Or do we make it a kind of test? You only have value if you can express rationality right now. And if you make that the test, then people who are severely brain damaged, people who are severely mentally, like a lot of people go back out, right? And so I appreciate the intuition that rationality is deeply tied to what makes us valuable, but I think it's because rationality is normative for human beings. So I think even those who, for whatever reason, cannot currently express rationality, but ought, under appropriate circumstances, to be able to, I think that's the criterion of value. And so for me, that lets everybody back in.
Thank you.
I just have one comment of thinking about what is this thing if we don't call it a person from the moment of conception? It's not property. It's not a dog. It's not like what is this thing if not? Is it person, property, or something else? And I just think that the personhood lens is the most fitting and truthful.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm not really used to these things, but hope you don't mind my stumbling. My question is mainly for, I believe, Doctor, you are? Okay, well, I have a question for you.
Sure.
Well, I guess not a question, but I guess your idea on it. So you briefly brought up the circumstance of rape, which is usually an argument for abortion, rape or incest, that is. I personally had carried the past of being raped by a family member of mine and had a child arose from that. I know that years from then I knew morally that it would be wrong if I had gotten pregnant. I know for certain now that the cell has potential to become a baby, and I know I'm not the only one. I have here quoted words from my biology class, actually. Life is defined by what living things do, and the first thing is reproduce, as well as all living things are made of cells. And that's what a lot of pro-abortionists like to argue with, is that the thing inside of you is a clump of cells. It has the potential to become a child. So for now, if it does have a potential to become a child, why would you punish the child for the sins of the father? If you had been raped by someone, and in this case, my family member, why would I punish a child for something that they had done? And for those people who do it not for medical reasons and not for reasons of rape or incest, what do you think about those who get abortions otherwise and don't take responsibility?
Okay. I actually think that question about the status of a fetus that's been conceived by rape is more of a question for a lot of pro-life advocates, because it's the pro-life advocates that say no abortions except for rape and incest, right? So they're the ones that are making this distinction between what value a fetus has if it's been the product of rape or not. Someone that's pro-choice would say you have a right to an abortion in the case of rape and in the case of non-rape, right? So that exception is made more from the pro-life category than the pro-choice category. So I would say that. And in terms of potential, I agree that the fetus is a human that has the potential for personhood. And I think that we need to treat the fetus that way. I do think that because of the arguments that we've talked about, that still means that women have a right to get an abortion for the same reasons I think Shimp has a right to deny his bone marrow to his cousin, even though his cousin is a person, right? But I just don't think in the end that acknowledging fetal personhood gets you to abortions are impermissible. I think there's a gap there. But again, the whole exceptions for rape and incest, that's something that I hear much more from the pro-life side than the pro-choice side.
With that being said, then I would like to open that to all the panelists and get their view on it as well.
Well, I mean, I guess this is only what I've been saying from the beginning, I think, is that I don't think you punish the child for the sins of the father. I think life puts us in extremely difficult situations. I think we don't know how we're going to react in those situations. But I do think there's a right thing to do. So I understand your question, and my answer, which is a hard answer, is you shouldn't punish the child for the sins of the father.
Yeah. Thank you.
I agree with that position.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much. Very interesting presentations. So I want to go back to Judith Jarvis Thompson, because I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding of her argument. So I'm going to try to make the argument very simple. My understanding of Thompson's paper is that even if we assume that at any time, all the way to conception, the fetus has a right to life, it doesn't follow that abortion is murder. Mm-hmm. By murder, it means intentional, unjustified killing. So it's the unjustified, morally unjustified, that is the burden here. I think she's right about that. Just logically, it won't follow. And I think her whole paper is about saying what else you need. In other words, what else the pro-life people need in order to get this argument from the fetus has a right to life to abortion is murder. And I think the implication of the paper is what you need is the right to be sustained. That's what you need. If you get that, then you may be able to get the argument going. The only problem is, even if you assume that the right to life exists, let's say based on continuity arguments and stuff like that, where do you get the right to be sustained? What is the justification for that? Now, I think that Dr. Noble gave us some kind of an answer, which is vulnerability thesis. In other words, if anybody is vulnerable, everybody else has an obligation to support them. That's a very strong positive right. The right to life is a negative right. It's only against any attempt to threaten the life of a person. But the right to be sustained is a positive right. It's the right to have somebody else give one something that is needed. Now, if you assume that you have, in general, based on vulnerability arguments, a right to be sustained for everybody, you're going to get to some real interesting conclusions. Because, I don't know, maybe some people here need they're vulnerable to something. I have to immediately jump and give them something in order to, so I'm not sure you can build a system of obligations based on vulnerability. So that's sort of one question I have. The other one that I had was just to make a correcting comment. It's certainly not true that prior to Dobbs, we were not allowed to discuss abortion. The literature on abortion prior to Dobbs is multitude. So it's not as if prior to Dobbs there was some sort of prohibition on discussing abortion. I can most likely dig up hundreds of papers, and so could everybody else, about abortion and the debates on that. So if you could clarify what exactly did you mean when you said, now we are free to talk about abortion like here. I think we were able to talk about abortion prior to that, too.
Yeah, so just quickly to address that question, what I mean is that Dobbs returned to the people of the states the ability to be represented by their elected officials, to have the laws reflect their will and what they desire. So before Dobbs, under the Roe and Casey regime, the states were handcuffed by not being able to enact, even reasonable common sense restrictions at certain points. So I think that now it opens up for us to have this conversation and have the laws meaningfully affected by the discourse is the landscape that we're in right now. And in regards to your question about the right to be sustained, I would just clarify here and put a pin in the fact that we're talking about children. And all of our laws, they do require children to be sustained, so to speak. We have laws against abandonment and abuse of neglect of children. The state is responsible for the welfare of children when their parents fail to provide for them. So we're talking in this abortion context, we are talking about protecting the lives of children, and the states do have compelling interests in providing protections and creating laws that reflect that we should have those rights on the books.
You're not going to get that from continuity, because anybody here doesn't have a right against somebody, particularly to be sustained by them. So the continuity argument is not going to work. Also, the right to be sustained of children, which the state does have an interest to protect, does not attach specifically to the parents. If the parents cannot do so, then the community or some other ways of being sustained. But in this case, the fetus needs the right to be sustained in order to derive the pro-life conclusion that abortion is murder. And where do you get that right from? Now, Dr. Noble provided a general thesis, which is the vulnerability thesis.
So, and in fairness, right, I only had 20 minutes, right? So I couldn't work out all the nuances. So. No, I mean, look, the people who defend the vulnerability thesis obviously are aware of the questions that are going to arise, right, and the complexities, right? And I think it's worth pointing out that this is a very specific instance of vulnerability, right? It's where if I don't continue to provide the support, if I forcibly evict you, you're going to die, right? And it seems to me that in that case, I do have an obligation to provide you with that support. Now, do I have an obligation to walk across the room and put my hand on Henry Fonda's fevered brow or whatever, right? That gets more complicated. But I actually do think when we think about what we talk not just about child abuse, we talk about elder abuse. Nobody ever asks to be obligated to their elderly parents, right? But we expect children to care for their elderly parents, and we expect the ones who are nearby living in the city to take care of that parent. And when we find them fused to their bed in their own filth, we bring them up on charges because that is their child and they were in a special position to provide support. And we should, because I think we are all connected to it. And it's not the way we tend to think about obligations, I grant you that. Right? It's not an American way of thinking about obligations. It's not a libertarian way of thinking about obligations. I'm just proposing that might be the right way of thinking about obligations. And so it's something that, yes, it needs to be worked out, and it's going to have to be clarified. But maybe if we find out that someone in this room needs food, maybe we actually do have an obligation to help them out.
Then who among all of us has the obligation?
Maybe we all do. Or maybe the person best situated, who is closest to them, the person who has money in their wallet. I mean, we do this all the time. And so I don't think it's particularly odd.
So then the argument is not based on that this person has a particular right against another particular person. So it's not going to be a language of rights. It's going to be a language of some general obligations of that others have toward vulnerable people and degrees of obligation.
Quite possibly. Look, I mean, there are situations where women have gone into the hospital and found themselves impregnated with somebody else's child because medical mistakes happen, right? If that happened to me, and some of the women that happened to, they carry the child to term and they give it to if that happened to me, I would feel obligated to carry it. And that, even if it was someone else's child. I think when we find ourselves in situations where other people need us and their lives depend on us, I feel like we have an obligation to step up.
So I'm going to actually tag onto the end of that, because if you're talking about the person that's best suited, there's a lot of assumption that goes into assuming that the person that is carrying the fetus is at all in myriad ways capable of doing so. So they may not be physically capable of doing so. They might have medical reasons that would preclude a safe or healthy pregnancy. They might have mental health reasons as to why they shouldn't carry a pregnancy to term. They might have sociological reasons, socioeconomic reasons, that once that fetus is born and then becomes a child, a baby, at that point they are not in a position to care for it. And that segues into another point you made about the fact that women don't want to give their children up for, or people don't want to give their children up for adoption, and that they can't because they have this overwhelming maternal nurturing need to know what's happening to that child. I would argue, one, that presumes an awful lot of people who get pregnant. There are plenty of people who are pregnant, who have been pregnant, who have even given birth, who do not have those maternal needs, those maternal instincts. They do not have an undying need to know what's happening to their children. Some of them might give them up for adoption, and some of them don't. Some of them keep them, and then they do neglect them, and then they do abuse them, and then those children do die. So when we do not offer an option that keeps all of that suffering from occurring, such as an abortion, we've harmed everybody in that scenario.
So I just want to pick out something that you said, because I think it's important to my response. You said when the baby is born and becomes a child. I think that's where an important place where we differ, right? Because I think that the baby is a person before birth. My daughter was born a month early. I don't think she suddenly became a person on her due date, even, so I think that. But then the other thing is that, yeah, there are terrible scenarios, and there's neglect and abuse, and all of these other things, and I don't mean to downplay that. And here I'm one of those people that I was talking about early on. I just don't think the way out of those terrible, terrible stories is killing the child, because I think it's wrong to kill innocent children, and I don't think that's saving everybody's suffering. I think that's causing a lot of suffering to one party and suffering to other parties. I just don't think that's the way out. So, yeah. And when you're in these hard situations where two lives are at stake, then I think you're in a situation where we face medically all the time, where you can only save one of two lives, and hard questions come into play there. But I don't think it's ever an easy question.
It may not be easy, but I think when the two lives are, one is a living, functioning, breathing human being, and the other is not yet any of those things, it's a pretty simple.
And I think that's where we differ. Because I deny the premise that only one of them is a living, functioning, breathing human being. That's where we differ.
So what does a fetus do?
It lives, it functions, it breathes. Right? Or it takes in nutrients, even if it's not taking in air.
Yeah, my
right?
cancer did too, but I removed it.
Well, are you really going to compare a fetus to a tumor? I don't even think Dr. Manning is going to compare a fetus to a tumor.
But if your point is that taking nutrients is the definition of life.
I'm not claiming that, right? I'm claiming that being an organism, right, which your cancer wasn't, sorry. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be flip, and I'm not trying to but I do think that the fetus is a person. And I think the fetus is a person at a very early stage.
When it's an embryo?
Yes.
When it's a zygote?
Yes.
And it can function by itself?
It is.
It's not. It's living off of the body of another person.
Sure. But I don't see why that would make it not have value.
It does have value. And
I don't see why that would make it not a person. Are Siamese twins not people because they depend on the body of another person to stay alive?
They have two separate persons.
Not always. Sometimes they share a heart, sometimes they share a brain, sometimes they share lungs.
Okay, well, then you can ask them if they are.
Well,
you can't ask in a zygote. But anyway, so the point of all that being is that you are implementing your thoughts, right? You're saying, I don't think that's right. But why do you get to make those decisions for me?
I don't think I get to make those, I don't think it's just kind of like my opinion. I mean, we have laws against fraud, we have laws against murder, we have laws against all kinds of things, and nobody says, oh, well, don't tell me I can't shoplift, you're just imposing your morality on me. Well, we
If
actually, I mean,
someone's
moral.
hungry, I will absolutely turn away if they're shoplifting. There are moral arguments to all of those things.
Okay. Fine. But I'm not saying, but see, you and I are agreeing here, right, that there is a moral conversation to be had, that there is a truth, right, about right and wrong.
No,
So
because you're saying that shoplifting is wrong, and I'm saying there are times when it's right.
I actually agree with you that it is
So
not
I'm
wrong to
also
shoplift
saying
when
there are
you're
times
starving.
when
Like, I actually
abortion
do
can be
agree with you.
right.
I actually do agree with you on that. But my point was we make laws, right? And laws presuppose a shared agreement that things are wrong.
Okay, so then going back to laws, because you had previously mentioned that sending things back to the states was because that was what the majority of people wanted, but we've seen that the majority of people actually want abortion to be legal.
If you guys will
So-
forgive me, I'm sorry. We're over time now, and there's still 2 more people that want to ask questions. And if we could get them in
There wasn't
real
anyone
quick.
back there when I walked up here.
And that's life. So I have to ask if we can allow the last 2 to get in while we have the time, because we do have our time constraints. I'm very sorry. Thank you very much for your questions.
Hello. So one of my questions is, like more legally speaking, what is like for starters, what is the current legal situation of Arizona regarding abortion right now?
Arizona has a 15-week ban in place.
Okay. It's just that, because I was like seeing at the news and saying that it was banned already, but okay. And do you think, like for you, legally speaking too, do you think that laws are like obsolete at this point of life? Like taking into account like the current society? Do you think that laws still work? Or maybe another question, do you think that it is reasonable to go back on history to make decisions regarding our current society?
Yes, absolutely, I do. I think that we have the Constitution of the United States of America that sets forth the rights of every person that lives in this country. Within that document, there are certain enumerated rights, and then there are other rights that are protected because they are deeply rooted in our nation's history and tradition, and because they are integral to the concept of ordered liberty.
Okay. So you think that the foundations of how laws were created and like hundreds of years ago, like maybe just 100 or 2 years ago, it still is reasonable to think that same way that we used to think before today?
Yeah, that's the bedrock of our democratic republic, is based on those founding documents.
And what about women's rights before that?
What's your question?
And not without speaking about abortion, right? Like women's rights to vote, for example. Why is that? They didn't used to think like that before. Now they did because of our new ways of thinking and new ideologies.
That right is something that is recognized in our Constitution. That's recognized in our guiding document that governs our society and all of the laws that flow from it.
Okay. Now I would go more to the other spectrum of it. Do you think that this is more like this for all of you? Is this more like a moral issue or a scientific issue? What do you think it would be more of it? Do you think if we have more scientific advances, we would be able to solve this at some point?
I think it's more of a moral issue, but that science definitely has a position to add into the issue. And I do think scientific advances change the moral argument. Like if it were possible to gestate a fetus fully outside the womb, I think that would significantly change abortion ethics. So both, I guess I would say.
Okay, I'm not sure if you guys already answered this question. I think you did. I'm just gonna read it again. If a person is a human being with a mind, could a mentally disabled person have not the right to live anymore, since they don't have a mind?
Mentally disabled people have minds.
But
They're
they
conscious and they're sentient.
Okay.
So they have minds. I mean, at a certain point, they may lack self-consciousness. When they're really, really disabled, they may lack self-consciousness, but but self-consciousness for me is not relevant consciousnesses.
And so what is the point where you define if a fetus is a person or not?
So the cortex, which is where consciousness starts to work, is fully developed to allow for consciousness life at about between 20 to 25 weeks gestation. I don't think that a 15-week-old fetus can feel pain. I think there's a lot of neurobiology that shows that the mental necessity, the mental parts that are necessary to feel sentience and pain happens between the end of the second trimester and the beginning of the third.
Okay, and let's just say, I don't know if it's happened yet.
I might have to cut you off.
Oh, okay.
So apologize for that. We got one more
Thank
to round us out. Thank you, though, for all of your questions.
Coffee spill in there. I apologize for keeping us significantly over time.
No, this is a really important conversation. People have a lot of questions that come along with it, and that's just the nature of it. So, but please. Yeah. Oh, well, it's a physics question, then we got to call it out.
Just one. What responsibilities are put on a person who has intercourse, if any responsibilities at all? Because I would think with something like driving, by driving you are accepting the responsibilities of what might happen in an accident or whatnot. So I would think that by just simply having intercourse and consenting to intercourse, you would be accepting the responsibility or possibly the risks of bearing this child.
So I think that question can go both ways. So like in certain situations, so if I'm driving and I hit somebody and it's my fault, I have a moral obligation to try to save, right? So there's one example of if you knew X was going to happen and you put yourself in a situation that X happened, then you are responsible for X, right? That's one. But there are other situations that's not immediately clear, right? If I go for a walk in a really bad neighborhood, knowing that I might get assaulted, I still have a right to not be assaulted, right? So there are situations where taking a chance means you're morally committed, and there are situations where taking a chance does not mean you're morally committed. In terms of abortion and pregnancy, I think it's more like the latter, because what you're giving up is something that's so intrusive to your body and to yourself that it's not a right that you can just easily give up because you knew that you could have a baby. There are just certain rights that you don't give up just because you're being careless. And I think that your right to your body is one of those rights.
And, I mean, just for parity, I disagree, because I don't think it's a question of rights that you give up. I think it's a question of being in situations where life asks you to do hard things. And just, we're at the end, so I can maybe tell a story. We have a friend who, grew up, had his wild youth, got, later in his 30s, got married, had a couple kids. One day out of the blue, gets a knock on the door. There's a girl he had a fling with in high school, and she's like, "This is your kid, it's your turn." And you know what, but she was absolutely right to do that, and he was absolutely obligated to pick up the slack. I mean, a lot of times we don't know what we're getting into, and a lot of times we just got unlucky, and I think we're still obligated nonetheless.
Okay, thank you.
Again, I want to thank all of you for attending. I want to thank our panelists, and I think this was a great success. Thank you.